Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight and making the time. It's a really exciting time to be alive at this moment in American history. Seeing all these different campaigns to abolish the campus police all across the country is really inspiring and really inspires the work that we do at the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign and at the newly formed Harvard Alliance Against Campus Cops. My name is Amanda, and I am a member of the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign. I am one of the organizers of Freedom Month, which hopefully I hope you guys can all attend more events throughout this month, leading up to the oral argument that we have in Zoom court against Harvard and their lawyers on September 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where I will actually be one of the people doing oral arguments. So if you want to watch me try my best up against some highly paid lawyers, definitely keep checking your email inbox. You can follow the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign for updates at Harvard PDC on Twitter. And you can also follow Hack on Twitter at CopFreeHarvard, at CopFreeHarvard. Joan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Joan. I'm a member of HACK. I'm also a rising 2L at Harvard Law School. I'm also involved with National Lawyers Guild on campus, and I'm excited to tell you guys some more about what we do. Yeah.
So my first question for you, Joan, is what is HACK?
So HACK is a group of students from across all different campuses at Harvard. So we have, here I have a few slides, and please let me know if these don't change. We have people from all different campuses, the med school, the grad school, the undergrads at the college, the law school, who are all united around abolishing the Harvard University Police Department. We started over the summer because there have been calls to defund the police nationally, but also because it came out that our Harvard Police Department was assisting with suppressing the uprisings in Boston. They were out on the street arresting people and responding to those protesters. So that really energized us and brought us all together to start working as a coalition.
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, don't actually realize the degrees to which the Harvard Police Department, which is supposedly a private police force, are actually very active in the greater Boston and Cambridge area and Massachusetts more generally, which is really concerning for a variety of reasons, which we'll touch on later. But I think a lot of the concerns that we get from people, from our critics right now, are why abolish and not reform? Isn't it better that we have a university police department instead of the brutal Cambridge Police Department? What is HACK's position on that?
So we think that our force should be completely abolished instead of reformed. We've seen, so part of what we've worked on is a report looking back at HUPD's history, and there's decades and decades of efforts at reforming the Harvard University Police Department to make it less racist, less sexist, to make it harm students less, harm the community less, and those have really been unsuccessful. There is sort of a system where the HUPD sort of seems to shield some students from the worst harm that might come from interactions with the police, but it's really being distributed in a very discriminatory manner. You know, if you're a student of color, we found a lot of incidents of police being called because they've been reported as suspicious persons or someone who doesn't seem like they belong on campus, and then they're getting harassed. And we just don't think that there's a way to reform a system that was established with the purpose of being racist and defending these sort of white supremacist property lines that is Harvard campus, you know? So we don't think it's possible to reform Harvard and university police in a way that's going to be acceptable.
Yeah, so part of the project of going through the HUPD logs. So there was this act called the Jeanne Cleary Act passed a little while ago, which requires all universities to release their police logs, regardless of whether or not it's a private or public university, so that prospective students are able to somehow assess the dangerousness of the campus before they come onto campus to be a student. So that's the only reason that the Harvard Police Department has agreed to share their logs with us at all, because they are legally required to. And of course, they do put them on their website, but when we wanted logs from not just, you know, the last 60 days, but the last 5 years, in the middle of the pandemic, the public information officer at Hupti made us come into the office where not everybody was wearing a mask and take pictures of the logs, 2,000 photos, instead of just sending us the PDFs. And so as a result, we had to recruit a lot of people to type and transcribe out the individual incidents of the logs. And I tell that boring story because it was just such a radicalizing experience to see on a day-to-day basis what the Harvard University Police Department is actually doing with their time, which presumably comes from our tuition money. All this harassment, all this racism, all this sexism that the police department is not only doing to Harvard students, but mostly to poor Black and brown Cambridge community members is being done on our dollar. I paid for that. And to me, that is the most disgusting and shocking thing of all. I would never, you know, permit my tuition money to be spent that way, and yet here we are. So my next question for you is, we touched upon this a few times already, but what is exactly the relationship between Hupti and the Cambridge Police Department and the Boston Police Department and the Massachusetts State Police? And do you need to change the slides?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think I have a slide on this one, but I'll leave this up for now. Yeah, but so our university has like these mutual aid agreements, which is a misleading name because mutual aid is usually such a good thing, where they will assist with the other local police forces in responding to things like the protests that we saw in downtown Boston. Also, Hupti officers, you might think that they have less powers and privileges because they're a campus police force, but really they're sworn in as special state police officers with deputy sheriff powers. So they can respond to any crime on campus or in anywhere in Cambridge, Somerville, and Boston. So they really have pretty broad and far-reaching powers. And sort of like you touched on, Amanda, they have these powers, but they also like don't have the same checks and transparency balances that like a public police force would have. So even though they're required to share their logs with us, they are not required to share internal investigations or budgetary information. So it's really hard for us to figure out how much we're spending on Hupti and how they're spending their money. And there was actually a suit by the Harvard Crimson a few years ago trying to get public records from Hupti, and they fought it. And the courts ruled that they were under no obligation to turn over any records other than those police logs that we talked about already, which are just sort of line by line incident reports.
Yeah, and apparently, based on what I've read, that there's been a bill introduced into the Massachusetts legislature multiple times to try and get Hupti's records to be public just like any other police force, and it has failed many a times, in part because Harvard devotes much lobbying efforts in the Massachusetts legislature to make sure that, you know, it doesn't release information to the public, which will create a liability, a legal liability for Harvard. So it's really a very heinous trade-off for the safety of Black and brown people in this area, just to save Harvard money, essentially. I mean, that's my theory.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think related to that, oh, sorry. Related to that, the Crimson did a whole expose about issues within the department, like ongoing problems with sexism, racism, and discrimination among police officers. And that's something we can't get any of those records, for instance, and is another thing that they're totally covering up by not releasing these records publicly.
So right now we're looking at the research that we've been currently underdoing the whole summer. We hope to release this very amazing report, very educational. Many intelligent people have worked very hard on this sometime in the beginning of October. So definitely follow us at Cop Free Harvard on Twitter and on Facebook and Instagram to make sure you are able to see it when it comes out. And Joan has outlined the chapters and the aspects of Hapti that we are researching. But because you have been doing this research, Joan, can you speak to a little bit like what does Harvard police do? What do they do?
They do a lot of harm. We'll start with that, but there's sort of a few main categories of types of incidents that they're responding to. The top two, and we're still putting this data together, so this is a little bit preliminary, but what we're seeing are a lot of suspicious activity responses and trespassing, which are basically the policing the borders of Harvard University's campus and trying to enforce who is or isn't allowed to be there. They're also responding to a lot of and unwanted guests is the other category there, which is basically a trespass where they don't enforce it as trespassing. They just sort of give them a warning. The other big category are thefts, which is there's a lot of very funny theft reports, which I think, Amanda, you pulled out a couple of those. But that's another large area that they're responding to and where they just really are ineffective. I think it's important to note, like, police have a super low rate of solving thefts, particularly of like personal items that are stolen. So even though they're responding to a lot of those calls, that's definitely not an area where they're making like a meaningful difference, I would argue, in terms of helping students. And then, yeah, they're doing arrests for trespassing and sometimes arresting people with sort of outstanding warrants. They also do a lot of crowd control and event security. And one thing that's been really interesting for me to learn as a law student is how involved the police are in responding to just like sort of residential life concerns. So they respond to a lot of noise complaints, which isn't so shocking, but police are also in charge of lockouts. So if you're an undergraduate student living in the dorms and you lose your key or lock yourself out of your room, you have to call the Harvard police to come and let you back in. And so if you're like a freshman woman or person of color who locks themselves out going to like the public showers and then has to call some big scary police officer to come let you in while you're waiting in your towel to get into your bedroom, like that's one super obvious area where it's completely inappropriate that the police are involved.
Yeah, so Joan, one of the statistics that have been floating around before we started our research was that 95% of the crimes that happen on campus are property crimes. And that statistic actually comes from the Harvard University Police Department website themselves. So to play a critic for a second, obviously you guys know what side I'm on, but to play a critic for a second, what's wrong with having a police department to prevent property theft? I don't want my things stolen. Why can't I have a police help me protect my expensive things?
Well, they clearly aren't preventing it since so much theft is happening to start off. And also, like, that protection of physical property is often coming at the cost of people's, physical well-being and physical safety. We've seen just like a lot of instances of the police arresting or harassing people who are experiencing homelessness, for instance, because they don't look like they belong on campus, or because they don't want them on campus, whereas other people who kind of fit the look of who should be at Harvard are sort of free to go about their way. And that just really creates a system where this sort of police violence and brutality and overcriminalization of houselessness is just exacerbated by Harvard University trying to pick out who should or shouldn't be on campus, or trying to like maintain this surveillance of what's going on constantly. And so that false sense of security, because theft obviously still is happening, is coming at the expense of people's safety and well-being.
Yeah, I love what you say about whenever someone asks me, I don't want to live in a world where people just steal stuff freely and the police the police aren't able to stop the thefts. I'm just like, sweetie, that's the world you live in. People are going to steal your things, and the police do not care. They will not help you, and they shouldn't. And I'm sympathetic to some of the, property thefts where, a student got their bike stolen and now they're $300 short for getting to class or something. I'm sympathetic to that. But do we need men with gun and tasers and pepper spray to solve that for you? you can file an insurance report with someone who doesn't have a gun. And, you know, Harvard has the resources to provide those alternatives. And one of the more shocking facts that came out of our research about Harvard and their police is that their budget is in the upwards of $15 to $20 million. $15 to $20 million coming from God knows where. So you keep hitting on this theme that so much of what the Harvard police do is enforce the borders between who is a Harvard student, who is a Harvard professor, and who's not. Because what they want really is a really pristine, shiny, utopian image of Harvard to present to tourists, to present to the world. And that doesn't include the brown and Black people who they marginalize very violently on a daily basis outside the Harvard gates. But throughout this entire process, I have always thought $12 million every single year could run a homeless shelter or a food bank or all of the above or anything else much more efficiently, much more effectively, much less violently. And yet we choose, our leaders choose to spend the money on guns and weapons and cars and uniforms instead. The latest expenditure that I noticed by the Harvard University Police Department are masks for the COVID pandemic, which have the Hupt logo on them. I mean, just what? Okay.
Yeah. It's so absurd.
Yeah. Right. So, but so you've mentioned this already, but you know, it seems as of right now, and per the latest climate surveys conducted by the student newspaper, the Crimson, that really Hupt still does provide a sense of security for many of the privileged students, more privileged students at Harvard. What is the hack response to that, and what does that say about the work that you have to do at this university?
Yeah, so just quickly to cover what those survey results are, the Crimson looked at, for entering students at the college, so these are undergrads, polling them on a variety of sort of political issues and where they stand. So looking at nationally, I think this is about 60 to 65% of undergraduate students seem to favor defunding police departments. But when they asked the same question about the Harvard police, the numbers were much lower. That's like 27, maybe 30%, it looks like, favor defunding Hupt. So there's a big gap there. We're not really sure why. These just came out and we're trying to learn more, but I imagine that you're right, that it's this sort of sense of wanting personal security and wanting, I think that there, like you kind of mentioned before, like there are some ways that Hupt sort of shields people from like how they would otherwise be handled by the police. If you are that sort of white, privileged male student, like looking at the police reports and how they respond, for example, to drug reports is, I think, a really clear example where Hupt does not ever pursue any sort of criminal consequences from what we've seen for like students using drugs. But there's at least a few arrests that I've seen where someone called the police to report someone using drugs in the vicinity who ends up then being sent to jail. So my answer to those students is that there's no better place to start than at our campus. I think first because there are all those issues with a private police department versus a public one that makes Hupt even more dangerous and I think susceptible to transparency and accountability problems than a public department. And because we have this sort of microcosm to try out new ways to accomplish abolition. So we've talked a lot in the group about how abolition isn't just about absence, it's also about presence. So we have an opportunity to use all this money that was going to Hupt to build really community-based responses to the sorts of harms that right now are handled as crimes. You mentioned like bike issues, like bike thefts. You know, we could have a way for students who have some property stolen to get a new bike for free or at a really low price. You know, we could be funding, homeless shelters for people in the community who are are in need. You know, we could be putting those resources to good use, and we have a list of some ideas, and one of our demands is for Harvard to research and implement some of these community-based response systems instead of relying on criminalization, coercion, and force, which is what the police have to offer.
Yeah, and one of our group members commented, like, it's always so ironic when your common liberal Harvard student is so for defunding the police. Yes, Black Lives Matter, defund the police, but when it comes to their own community, suddenly the tides change. So it becomes a question of where is the disconnect? Does the empathy go? Once it actually becomes an issue within their own backyard, which they have so much more responsibility for. So what do you want to share a few of the examples that you pulled to give the members?
Logs? Yeah, so I pulled a few. I'll let you guys sort of read them to yourselves, with calling out a few examples, but kind of going from the most frivolous to more serious. And I think it shows how these not just sort of something to laugh at, but also something that's causing really serious harm in the greater Cambridge community. So these are some reports. The first ones, someone called about a suspicious package. It turned out to be a new soap dispenser. Reporting theft of $3. A suspicious flyer in the garage that turned out to be an advertisement for a local band. Theft of laundry detergent. This one's kind of funny. Someone reported an individual staring at them through a window. It turns out that person was just sitting there studying. And then this last one I think we see a lot of. So someone's dispatched for an unwanted guest in the area. Police respond. They stop. They talk to that person. That person has to prove who they are and legitimate why they're there on campus. And it turns out that they're a student or someone who's allowed to be there. That might seem light, but that can be super invalidating and just sends the message to that person that they don't belong on our campus.
Right.
And sort of escalating here. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Did you?
Right, and as we know, a lot of the most brutal examples of police violence actually start from what people deem to be innocuous interactions with the police. So when a police officer approaches you and you're a person of color who historically has been targeted by the police, you don't know what is going to happen. And that really sends an unwelcoming message to the students and to non-students, whoever on this campus. A lot of emphasis is also placed on undocumented students. You know, undocumented students always live in the fear of being deported for whatever reason. So why is Harvard University Police Department asking them for their Harvard ID and putting them in a database? And God knows where that information is going to. God knows what policing agencies the Harvard University Police Department is collaborating with, because again, we can't ask. They have no laws governing their transparency. But the other thing that these logs really show is just the atrocious degree to which people would rather call the police on the silliest things than actually be a part of the community that they live in. And it really speaks to a carceral culture throughout the United States, throughout the world even, and especially here at Harvard, where so many students are coming to campus from such privileged backgrounds, about what it means to be in relationship with your neighbors and the people who you go to class with and live with and eat with and hang out with.
Totally. Yeah. And then just to touch briefly on a few more of these reports, these are a few where the police are responding to allegedly suspicious individuals who are supposed to be there, who are sleeping, waiting for their kid, looking for a quiet place to pray. And then on the right is two people who were at their car, didn't realize that they were even on Harvard's property, were given a verbal trespass warning. That might not sound serious, but then the next one is about someone who has a previous verbal trespass warning and was arrested just for being on campus. An officer saw them, knew they had a trespass warning, and they were arrested on the spot. And then here's even more arrests that Harvard's doing for trespassing. This one on the right is someone in the Smith Campus Center who's being arrested. And if you read that report there, it sounds like the officer originally stopped them and was just talking to them, didn't like the person's attitude, and then decided to arrest them. That's how I read that one, at least, because the officer cites disruptive and volatile remarks. So it just shows how, like, just completely violent, like an arrest is inherently a violent act, and really Harvard is using this police department to enforce its borders through acts of violence against the most vulnerable and marginalized people in the greater Cambridge community. Yeah, and so I think that you're totally right. It's totally alienating Harvard from the community that it's situated in. And I think those other sort of more frivolous calls about like thefts or someone who looks out of place, you know, where students are making those calls rather than sort of being really integrated in their communities and building connections with others. I think it's that same thing on a larger scale, where Harvard is totally disconnected from the people who are around it.
And thank you for digging these up, Joan. I think one of the lesser sexy aspects about student activism is all the research that goes into it. But especially, particularly for the Harvard University Police Department, so much of the work that we have to begin with is like myth debunking, just because, you know, Harvard students, maybe reasonably so, truly believe that the police are being paid very handsomely to keep Harvard safe. But I once was in a conversation with a student group talking about police abolition, and they were all uncomfortable with the idea of abolishing the Harvard police. But then I asked them, like, when's the last time you actually called them? So even though they have never found themselves in a situation enough to feel like they're in danger, they still think like the police are out there in the greater world doing something to help me, which, if you really think about it, is a really big leap to take, especially given the content of our research, So again, that report is coming out in early October, so be sure to follow us on our social media.
Yeah, and building off of that, we've also been working on what it'll be released along with our report, but a flyer with alternative resources instead of calling the police. So we just also, as an interim measure, want to start diverting as many calls as possible away from the police. And we're also working on a pledge that'll be released with the report, sort of asking students to run through these 5 questions before they call the police, so to identify ways that they can either let it go, confront it on their own, get other help, or reach another resource instead of relying on the police to solve all these problems. So that's something we can do now, even while we're working to defund the police and build up other resources and community-based solutions.
Yeah, and that concludes, right, Joan, the end of the presentation, and then we can get to the questions in the chat. So please take a moment to, audience members, please take a moment to think of any questions you have or comments, really. We're really excited to connect with other organizing groups at other universities. So if you're part of an organizing group, university affiliated or not, feel free to speak up again about the work that you're doing. I also wanted to say that I was typing a few of the logs up as well. And the one that really infuriated me was a man who was sleeping by Memorial Church on Harvard's yard, and someone called the police on him for sleeping. And at first the Harvard police came and woke him up and told him he had to go, but then they decided to run a warrant check on him, and apparently he had a warrant for something else. So his crime essentially was daring to take a nap outside near a church, and as a result he ended up in jail. I think that's the type of cruelty that people at Harvard need to know. This is what your work and your tuition dollars are paying for. This is the type of violence that is supposed to keep you safe, but in reality doesn't keep you safe, and probably in fact makes the campus a more dangerous place to be. So I think we have a long road ahead of us with about teaching critical thinking, empathy, relationships, and the alternatives are actually proven to be effective in reducing community violence.
Well, I just really quickly, before we do questions, want to touch on a couple other things that we're working on, just in case there's questions about them. The first is we had a direct action over the summer where we put signs and had some speakers and live music at President Pacau's house. So here's a photo from that. You can learn more about that on our social. And we're also working on story collection about people's interactions with HUPD. And we're working on sort of doing an interview program, reaching out to members of the Harvard community who've been affected by the Harvard police, so we can document and share those stories. So those 2 things we're working on, and I'm just going to leave it up on our demands if anyone has questions about those. These are our 8 demands. There'll be more detail on those in our long form report when that's released, but these are our asks that will bring us down the road towards complete abolition of HUPD.
Is there plans to contact the administration directly? Have you contacted them yet? Or have we?
So we had the action at Pacau's house, and then the plan is to deliver the long form report to them once that's finished. So that'll be sort of, I think, our first formal interaction with the administration.
Okay. So the first question in the chat is, what would it take to stop using HUPD as crowd control at university events? Are those decisions about which events they patrol based on individual event organizers? Or is it required by the university? That's a good question. I actually don't know.
Yeah, so that's something that we've talked about, because there is also a private Securitas at Harvard that does just event management. And we think that's still using sort of a surveillance and coercion-based system to respond to something that doesn't really require a police presence. So we're looking for alternatives to that. I think in a lot of ways we want to have student managed security. So we're looking at doing, like, for example, a training this fall on how to be an event marshal and how to do your own crowd control. But one of the problems, I think, is that in a lot of cases, the police and security presence is being mandated by the university. I don't think it's the central university. I think a lot of it is by school. For instance, the law school, there is always a police officer at any event involving Israel or Palestine. Even if they're not wanted there, they will be there outside the room with their gun, paying attention to who's coming and going, and it's extremely uncomfortable. So that's something where it's a combination of getting the school to change its policies to allow us to kind of take ownership over our own event management, and developing those sort of alternate skills so that we can do this on our own.
Marina asked, what is the difference or importance in organizing to abolish the Harvard police versus organizing to abolish or defund the Cambridge or Boston police?
Well, that's a good question. There's a lot to go at there. I think one of the differences, sort of like I highlighted before, is I think even if you aren't on board with abolishing the local police force, there is good reasons to support abolishing HUPD. So I think it can be a good place to start with bringing people on board, and with exerting our power as students. HUPD is funded by our tuition money, and they're sort of committing this violence in our name. So I think we have a lot of sort of power here and a lot of ability, like I said before, to use that money, to use sort of like the natural community cohesion of a school to really develop these abolitionist community-based responses to the harms that are right now treated as crimes. So I think that's why we are specifically tackling Harvard versus sort of focusing on the Cambridge police, because of our power as students. And I think that it's a good way to sort of build the case for abolition more broadly.
I see that Cheryl has raised your hand. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask? Maybe you can't. Oh, sorry. I can't hear you.
Yeah, we can't hear you if you're talking.
Really?
Oh, now I can. I heard the really.
Okay. All right. Thank you all so much for this event. I'm really interested in how people approach the I guess abolition and sort of not participating in the carceral system. I think with the co-optation of abolitionist movements, what I'm learning to see is that abolition works really, really well for white folks, non-Black people, corporations, sort of, and NGOs. And so one of my fears is that this is actually more so co-optation of abolition rather than a really deep investment. And so I guess what's the game plan to make sure that this really sort of stays within the Black tradition, the tradition of people of African descent, but also like really like pairs up with reparations for real, for real. Anyways, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that's really a great point. I think there's a famous quote, now I can't think of who said it, about how like we already practice abolition. That's what like a white suburb looks like, right? And so I think it can be easy to turn Harvard into that same deal. I think the important thing there, I'd say my initial thoughts are like really focusing on the ways that HUPD harms our community. I think that the sort of trespassing enforcement and stuff like that, like we can't just let that fall by the wayside and focus more on how HUPD affects students. And I'd also say we are planning a lot of events and programming. Right now we're working on a series of 3 events that will focus on sort of some learning and education on abolitionist theory, and on sort of like you talked about the sort of Black radical tradition behind abolitionist organizing and thought. So yeah, that's probably something that we should be very intentional about as we move forward. One event definitely isn't enough. And another point is like you mentioned about reparations, redistributing the HUPD budget to community members. I think I mentioned before, like that money could go to a shelter. I guess I just want to be explicit. Like Harvard runs a shelter right now, and we were doing research on it for our alternatives to policing flyer, and it is not well respected or liked by the community as far as we could tell. And I think you're right, it's not a solution for Harvard to be the ones building these programs. Like they need to be handing that money over to people in the community who can manage and spend it. And it's not really going to be reparative if Harvard's doling out resources and controlling their administration. So that's a great point. Yeah.
There are a lot of members of HAC right now in the chat, in the Zoom call as well. So if anybody else wants to jump in and answer Sharon and Cheryl's question, please feel free to. And the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign also places a big emphasis on making sure that we are in connection with community organizations who have been doing this abolitionist work in the Boston, Massachusetts area for far, far longer than we have, and probably far longer than we will. And one of the great organizations that I really respect in Boston is Families for Justice as Healing, who have been leading the fight against the Boston police in the Massachusetts legislature very recently, this last budgeting season. So it is always so important to reconnect with the most marginalized people. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Tolly said, I'm curious about your high-level strategy to make progress on these 8 great steps. Is there something in particular that you're leading with? For example, are you advocating for the creation of a civilian response team before HUPD is abolished or defunded?
I don't think we've, Amanda, please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we've talked specifically about, I think that the order of the steps is somewhat intentional, but I don't think we've really sort of strategized beyond handing these off to the administration, like which ones we're gonna work on first. And if there's other members who are on here who want to jump in, I welcome you to do that. But I do think just strategically that the budget cut is gonna probably have to be paired with that sort of like funding to communities and implementing these alternative civilian responses. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll add more to that. So part of the philosophy of abolition at HAC is that we don't think abolition is a white paper, right? So people really always ask you, like, give me your 10-step paper about how you're gonna fix violence and fix failure of infrastructure, and then maybe we'll consider getting rid of the police. But abolition is a process of back and forth and a million different trials and errors of what's working and what's not. Historically, what's happened is, we said, let's give these men a state pass to use physical violence on other people. And people said that doesn't work. So then we're like, let's give them guns. And they're like, that doesn't work. Let's give them tasers. Like, we want to take the opposite approach, which is if something doesn't work, let's actually change it to address the harms that are being done to community members. So with regards to civilian response team, this is a really becoming a more common plan to institute instead of sending Harvard police officers to mental health crises, for example, which is what Harvard does now, and it is horrifying. And this actually ties in a question that I wanted to ask about, like, sexual assault too. I mean, it's easy for us to dismiss, property crimes or getting your Tide Pod stolen, but what about the violence and the sexual assault pandemic that's happening on college campuses? Can we really in good faith advocate to get rid of the Harvard Police Department when there are so many victims of sexual assault at Harvard?
Absolutely. Actually, that is the issue that led me to police abolition. In college, all of the groups I was involved in were focused on sexual assault prevention and response. I was on a student hotline. I worked on prevention education, and that was the first time as a relatively privileged white woman I was exposed to the idea that, oh, police are doing nothing to solve this problem and they're actually making it worse. I think that the idea that police can address sexual violence is based largely on a myth of how sexual violence happens. Like, we have this stereotype of the stranger jumping out at you in an alley and something like very sort of, I mean, all rape and sexual assault is violent, but involving like very sort of physical coercion, and like, that's just not how it happens. Like, especially on college campuses, it's likely to be someone you know. It's probably someone that you like or have like goodwill towards until this event happens. You might not recognize what happened to you as a sexual assault until later, when you've talked to someone else about it or you've had time to process and reflect. There's likely to be alcohol involved. And doing that work in college, I just heard so many stories of people who would go to the police and face victim blaming and harassment, and the police and criminal justice system just was not at all set up to respond to the sorts of sexual assaults that are happening in most cases. And so, yeah, for me, that just totally opened my eyes to the fact that this is not well suited to this. And we've seen this, so looking at some of the like history research that we did, just the Harvard police was like completely in the era of like Take Back the Night in the like 60s and 70s, which is completely non-responsive to student concerns about how sexual violence happened, and even things that would sort of respond to that more like stereotypical sexual assault scenario, like offering escorts to walk people back from the library at night and things like that. They were just like completely uncooperative with those sorts of things. But on the other side, in terms of like a civilian or community-based response, we already do have some things like that. We have some peer counselors in the college, and one of our asks is going to be for Harvard to look more seriously into expanding that service. I was in a student-run and student-operated sexual assault response hotline in college. So like, there are other ways to respond to this problem. There's also other ways to do education that will prevent this from happening in the first place and changing our culture around sexual violence. And the police are not going to do that.
Yeah, and to clarify about the safety walk thing, the escort service, there was an era in Harvard history, I think it was maybe in the 70s, where there was a lot of rapes being reported or women were getting stabbed. So Harvard did temporarily institute this volunteer-based escort service where you can call someone and they will walk you home, which absolutely, hands down, fantastic. For some reason, that stopped. And now we have an escort service, which is, again, volunteer-based, a grad-based, and like a volunteer from a graduate school and the college who are rooted through HUPTY. So these volunteer safety escorts are now trained by HUPTY, and presumably if you call them for help, you're putting yourself into HUPTY's path or HUPTY's jurisdiction of some sort. So now you're a student who is scared to walk somewhere, but and you want to call someone else to come get you and help you feel safe when you're walking home, but you have to make the choice between whether or not you want to be tied closer or putting yourself even in more possible danger by putting yourself closer to a Hupti officer. And honestly, not making any accusations towards the Harvard University police specifically, the police as a general matter are very often perpetrators of sexual violence themselves. So if you, for example, are a young freshman college girl and you're at a party and you're in a really uncomfortable situation and you drank too much, do you want to be the girl who is calling Hupti to break up the party? Are you going to be the girl who wants to cry and accuse someone of something? Let's not force, someone who's drunk and in need of help to make that decision at that current moment. Let's have a civilian intervener. Let's have someone who isn't out to show up and pop in the door with guns and tasers. Let's have someone who come and make sure that that person is safe and that they get home.
Totally.
I mean, when I first got to Harvard, I remember I was walking to the grocery store with some of my friends, and there was some man who was following us and threatening to kill us. And I became really scared to walk to the grocery store by myself. And I just thought, what if there was a service that could have, helped send someone to walk with me? And now looking back, it's absolutely wild to me that, we would spend $15 million on people to drive really expensive cars and bikes and wear silly uniforms instead of giving non-violent jobs to people to actually provide a service that is very much needed.
Yeah, and sort of off of what you were saying too, we are also planning to have some sort of bystander intervention training. So what you can do if you see sort of an unsafe situation and how to intervene safely and help protect someone else without having to rely on calling the police. So that's also something you can look out for.
So the Harvard Alliance Against Campus Cops is organizing a national call for student activists all over the country who either have been doing anti-policing work on campus or who want to start an anti-police campaign on their campus. So if you're interested, you can email us at abolishhupti@gmail.com. Or you can tweet us or DM us at Twitter, CopFree Harvard. So if nobody has any other questions, I will close by thanking everybody for coming. And I really encourage everyone to put in their calendars the oral argument against Harvard to divest from prisons. We sued Harvard to divest from prisons and to stop profiteering off of the mass torture, abuse, and caging of Black and brown people. And of course, Harvard said no. So now we're fighting them in court over it. And that oral argument is on September 29th. That's a Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And I want to thank Joan for taking the time to put these beautiful slides together and to tell us about all the amazing work that she does. Joan, do you have anything you want to say?
Just thank you so much to everyone who came out to learn more about us. And we're really looking forward to doing more work to educate our campus and to defund and abolish Hupti. So look out for more. Thank you so much for all the questions too today and input. Thanks.